Welcome to Urban Crime Stories. In this episode, we will examine 3 cold cases that still haunt the community. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so that you will not miss any upcoming episodes. Number 1. The tragic story of the Kuria family. On August 1st, 2007, the Kuria family's search for safety and a better future was shattered by an unimaginable act of violence. Jane Kuria, her 2 daughters Isabella and Annabelle, were brutally beaten to death in their home in Powder Springs, Georgia. Jane's young son Jeremy and his cousin Peter Thandie survived the attack, but their memory of that fateful night remains lost. As investigators struggle with a lack of evidence and unanswered questions, the case remains cold, leaving the family and the community without closure. Jane Kuria, a 46-year-old mother of 3, was originally from Kenya. Following the death of her husband in 2002, Jane made the life-altering decision to leave her home country with her children. Concerned for their safety due to her outspoken opposition to female genital mutilation, or FGM, Jane sought asylum in the United States. She believed her activism on the sensitive issue could make her a target in Kenya, where FGM remained a deeply rooted cultural practice. The family settled in Powder Springs, Georgia, in the hope of building a secure future away from the threats they faced back home. Despite the fresh start, the Kuria family's life in the United States was fraught with uncertainty. Jane's application for asylum was rejected, a significant setback that placed the family in a precarious legal situation. Determined to protect her children and continue advocating for the cause she believed in, Jane appealed the decision. Her fight for asylum reflected not only her commitment to her children's well-being, but also her resilience in standing up against a harmful practice despite the risks involved. However, the appeal process was a long and stressful ordeal, leaving the family in limbo as they awaited a resolution. On August 1st, 2007, tragedy struck in the Kuria household, shattering the lives of the family forever. The events that unfolded that day were both unexpected and devastating, leaving their close-knit community in shock. The Kurias, known for their warmth and resilience, suddenly found themselves at the center of a horrifying incident that sent ripples through Powder Springs. The tragedy was not only a devastating blow to the family, but also to the wider network of friends and advocates who had supported Jane in her mission. On the morning of August 1st, 2007, Jane Kuria's sister-in-law, Pauline Thandie, grew increasingly anxious when her repeated calls to the Kuria household went unanswered. Concerned that something was amiss, Pauline decided to visit the home alongside her niece, Diana Mena. Arriving at the Powder Springs residence, the sense of unease deepened as they approached the quiet house. Pauline and Diana could not have anticipated the horrifying discovery that awaited them inside. Diana was the first to step into the house, where she was confronted by a gruesome scene. She found a lifeless, bloodied body, and it quickly became apparent that a terrible act of violence had occurred. As they searched the home, they discovered the bodies of Jane Kuria and her 2 daughters, 19-year-old Isabella and 16-year-old Annabelle. All 3 had been brutally beaten to death. The shock of the violence was overwhelming, and the tragedy sent Pauline and Diana into a state of disbelief and despair. In addition to the 3 tragic fatalities, Jane's 7-year-old son, Jeremy, and his 10-year-old cousin, Peter Thandie, were also victims of the attack. Unlike the others, the boys survived, although they had been severely beaten and left unconscious. Emergency responders were called to the scene and quickly transported Jeremy and Peter to the hospital for urgent medical care. Both boys would eventually recover from their physical injuries, but the emotional and psychological scars of that day would remain. Tragically, neither of them retained any memory of the harrowing events. The brutal murders of Jane Kuria and her daughters sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. Friends, family, and advocates who had known Jane for her courage and resilience were left grappling with the senselessness of the crime. The Kuria family, who had sought refuge in the United States to escape danger, now faced unimaginable tragedy on what was supposed to be safe ground. The survivors, Jeremy and Peter, became the focus of concern as they embarked on the long road to healing. As the investigation into the Kuria family murders unfolded, authorities faced an uphill battle in their search for answers. No murder weapon was recovered, and investigators were unable to locate usable DNA evidence at the crime scene. These setbacks hindered the progress of the case, leaving detectives to rely on witness statements and circumstantial evidence. Early on, two individuals emerged as potential persons of interest: Patrick, an acquaintance of Jane who had maintained a close relationship with her, and Elizabeth, a fellow churchgoer who later gained custody of Jane's surviving son, Jeremy. Their connections to the family raised questions, but no substantial evidence linked either of them to the murders. Despite their connections to Jane and her children, neither Patrick nor Elizabeth was officially named as a suspect. Their involvement in the investigation remained peripheral, with no solid leads to suggest they were responsible for the violent attack. This lack of clarity added to the frustration of law enforcement, who were eager to find justice for Jane, Isabella, and Annabelle. Over time, the focus on these individuals diminished as detectives shifted their attention to other potential leads, though no breakthroughs were made. Cobb County detectives explored several theories to uncover a motive for the murders. One avenue of investigation considered whether the attack was retaliation for Jane's outspoken opposition to female genital mutilation. Jane's advocacy had made her a prominent figure in the Kenyan community, where her stance was controversial. However, after thorough inquiries, investigators found no evidence to support the theory of targeted retaliation. This conclusion left the case without a clear motive, further deepening the mystery surrounding the tragic events. As months turned into years, the lack of significant evidence caused the case to grow cold. The unresolved murders of Jane and her daughters became a haunting chapter in the lives of those who knew them. For the surviving members of the Kuria family, the absence of justice compounded their grief, leaving them with unanswered questions about the tragedy that had torn their lives apart. Jeremy, one of the two survivors of the brutal attack, faced additional challenges in the years following the tragedy. He underwent surgery to remove a brain tumor, which his family believes may have been triggered by the immense trauma he experienced during the attack. While he physically survived the horrifying ordeal, the emotional and psychological impact on his young life was profound. The tumor and its treatment added a new layer of hardship for Jeremy, highlighting the far-reaching consequences of the violence that devastated his family. This development introduced a complex dimension to the investigation, as authorities considered how the attack might have contributed to Jeremy's long-term health issues. Although Jeremy and his cousin Peter were unable to recall the events of that night, their survival remained a vital thread in the case. Investigators sought to piece together the sequence of events that led to the murders, hoping that advancements in forensic science or new leads might eventually shed light on the identity of the perpetrator. Despite the tireless efforts of law enforcement and the dedication of the cold case unit, the Kuria family murders remain unsolved. The lack of physical evidence and viable leads has made progress frustratingly slow. Each passing year has widened the gap between the horrific event and the possibility of resolution, leaving the family and community grappling with an unsettling absence of answers. The lingering mystery has turned the case into one of the most heartbreaking unsolved crimes in the state of Georgia. Number 2. The horrifying case of the Dardeen family. On November 18, 1987, the peaceful town of Ena, Illinois was rocked by the brutal murder of the Dardeen family. Keith Dardeen, a dedicated father and husband, failed to show up for work, prompting a disturbing discovery. Inside their trailer, authorities found the lifeless bodies of Keith's wife, Elaine, their 2-year-old son, Peter, and a newborn girl, all violently beaten to death. Keith's body was later found under mysterious circumstances, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. The case remains unsolved, shrouded in mystery, with multiple suspects and theories emerging over the years. Russell and Elaine Dardeen were residents of Ena, Illinois, where they lived a seemingly happy life with their 2-year-old son, Peter. In 1986, Keith purchased a trailer after completing his training to work as a treatment plant operator at the Rend Lake Water Conservancy District. Their home reflected the modest beginnings of a young family that held great hope for the future. By 1987, their happiness grew as Elaine became pregnant with their second child, bringing excitement and anticipation for their growing family. Despite their joy, Keith and Elaine had begun to feel uneasy about their surroundings. The area's rising violence and general sense of insecurity pushed them to consider a move for the safety of their family. This decision was also influenced by their desire to raise their children in a more stable and familiar environment. They decided to sell their mobile home and planned to relocate to Mount Carmel, Illinois, where Keith had grown up and his parents still lived. It was a step toward what they hoped would be a better future. In November 1987, their plans took a tragic and unforeseen turn. On November 18th, Keith, known for his reliability at the treatment plant, failed to show up for his shift. His absence was unusual, and he had not called his supervisor to report any issues. Concern grew throughout the day as repeated calls to the Dardeen home went unanswered. This silence was uncharacteristic of Keith, raising alarm among those who knew him well. By late afternoon, Keith's supervisor reached out to his parents, who still lived near each other in Mount Carmel, despite being divorced. Both expressed their surprise and concern, as they had no knowledge of any reason for Keith's unexplained absence. The situation quickly became more worrisome, as it was entirely out of character for Keith to neglect his responsibilities or fail to communicate. Don Dardeen, Keith's father, grew deeply concerned after learning about his son's uncharacteristic absence and unresponsive household. Taking immediate action, he contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and agreed to drive down to Ina, bringing the house key to meet deputies at Keith and Elaine's home. The small, unassuming trailer, located near Illinois Route 37 and the former Illinois Central Railroad tracks, was quiet upon their arrival. What awaited inside would shock even the most experienced law enforcement officers. Upon entering the home, deputies discovered a horrifying scene. The bodies of Elaine, 2-year-old Peter, and a newborn girl were found tucked into the same bed. Elaine had been bound and gagged with duct tape before being brutally beaten to death. Peter had suffered the same fate, with investigators identifying the murder weapon as a baseball bat, a cherished birthday gift to Peter from his father earlier that year. Elaine's injuries were so severe that she went into labor during the attack, delivering a baby girl. Tragically, the newborn's life was also violently ended in this unspeakable act of brutality. Amidst this horror, Keith was noticeably absent, as was the family's red 1981 Plymouth. Investigators initially theorized that Keith was responsible for the heinous crime and was now on the run. This suspicion prompted armed officers to search for him, including visiting his mother's home in Mount Carmel. However, as the investigation progressed, this theory unraveled in the most tragic and grisly manner. The following day, a group of hunters stumbled upon Keith's lifeless body in a wheat field near Rend Lake College, not far from the trailer. He had been shot 3 times, and his body showed further mutilation, with his penis severed. This gruesome discovery refuted earlier suspicions and confirmed that Keith was also a victim. Meanwhile, the red Plymouth was located outside the police station in Benton, approximately 11 miles south of the Dardeen family home. The vehicle's interior was spattered with blood, adding another layer of mystery to the unfolding case. The brutal murder of the Dardeen family stunned the community of Ina and left investigators grappling with one of the most horrifying and perplexing crimes they had ever encountered. What began as a search for a missing family man spiraled into an unthinkable tragedy, shattering the lives of those who knew the Dardeens and raising countless questions about who could commit such a monstrous act and why. The brutal murder of the Dardeen family sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Ina, Illinois, heightening the already pervasive fear of rising violence. Residents, gripped by anxiety, began carrying shotguns openly in their vehicles as a means of protection. The sense of unease extended to the town's youth. After high school basketball games, students no longer lingered outside to socialize. Instead, they stayed inside the building waiting for their parents to escort them safely to their vehicles. The killings had shaken the community to its core, forcing even the simplest routines to change drastically. In response to the shocking crime, local police agencies collaborated with the Illinois State Police to launch an extensive investigation. A team of 30 detectives worked tirelessly, dedicating themselves full-time to chasing leads and conducting interviews. Over 100 individuals were questioned as authorities searched for answers. Despite their relentless efforts, none of the evidence uncovered proved useful in solving the case, leaving investigators frustrated and the community without closure. Early on, a man taken into custody was released after questioning yielded no connection to the murders. Investigators also looked into a co-worker of Keith's with whom he had reportedly been in a dispute, but this lead failed to provide any significant breakthroughs. Each promising angle seemed to dissipate, leaving the case mired in uncertainty. In 1999, investigators briefly focused on Angel Maturino Resendiz, a notorious serial killer who often targeted victims near freight train tracks and had a pattern of beating them to death. His methods bore eerie similarities to the Dardeen case, particularly given the trailer's proximity to the former Illinois Central Railroad tracks. However, despite their initial interest, Illinois authorities were ultimately unable to establish any concrete connection between Resendiz and the murders, closing yet another potential avenue of investigation. The investigation into the Dardeen family murders took a new turn in the 2000s, when convicted serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells claimed responsibility for the heinous crime. Sells, who had been sentenced to death for the murder of a teenage girl in Texas, detailed his alleged involvement in the quadruple homicide. However, his confession brought little closure. Authorities in Texas refused to release him to assist Illinois police with their investigation, limiting any follow-up on his claims. This decision, combined with inconsistencies in his account, left both investigators and the Dardeen family skeptical of his involvement. Despite Sells's confession, he was never formally charged with the murders. His claims lacked corroboration, and some of the details he provided did not align with the evidence at the crime scene. While his modus operandi and violent history seemed to fit the nature of the crime, doubts persisted, leaving his alleged connection to the case unresolved. The inability to thoroughly investigate Sells's confession left a critical question unanswered, further compounding the frustrations surrounding the case. Over the years, the Dardeen murders have grown colder, with no definitive suspects or evidence pointing to the true perpetrator. Theories have ranged from random acts of violence to the possibility of another serial killer being responsible. Investigators continued to explore every lead, but the trail consistently ran cold. Each emerging theory only deepened the mystery, adding to the anguish of a community and family desperate for justice. Number 3. The unsolved case of the Pride family. On September 6, 1982, Valerie Pride and her two young daughters, Shantia and Duana, were brutally murdered in their South Phoenix home. Despite a series of intense investigations, the case went cold, leaving the community haunted by the unsolved crime. Over 40 years later, the mystery of who killed Valerie and her daughters remains unresolved, with fresh efforts to uncover the truth still ongoing. Valerie Pride, a 24-year-old mother of two young daughters, Shantia and Duana, was a trailblazer in her field. As one of the first female electricians at the Palo Verde power plant in Maricopa County, Arizona, she was in the final year of a rigorous 4-year apprentice program with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 640. Balancing the demands of her career and motherhood, Valerie worked tirelessly to provide a stable and promising future for her family. In the summer of 1982, Valerie made a significant step towards her future by purchasing a new home in a serene neighborhood in South Phoenix, Arizona. The decision was fueled by her hope of creating a safe and nurturing environment for her daughters. She envisioned the quiet streets and friendly community as the perfect setting for Shantia and Duana to grow up, surrounded by stability and opportunities. On Monday, September 6, 1982, Valerie and her daughters were settling into their new home, celebrating their first Labor Day in the quiet neighborhood of South Phoenix. What should have been a festive day for the young family took a sorrowful and unexpected turn. That afternoon, Valerie's boyfriend, Ben Daniels, received devastating news about his 9-year-old daughter from a previous relationship. She had suffered an epileptic seizure while taking a bath and tragically drowned. Rushing to the hospital where she had been taken, Ben was met with the heartbreaking confirmation that doctors had been unable to save her life. The grief of this sudden loss cast a shadow over what had been an otherwise ordinary day. At home, Valerie tried to maintain a sense of calm and normalcy for her daughters, despite the somber news surrounding Ben's tragedy. The home she had so carefully chosen as a haven for her family was now heavy with worry and sadness. Still, Valerie carried on, providing her girls with the love and stability they needed. even as the day's events weighed on her. That evening, as the household quieted down, she made a routine phone call to her brother, seeking comfort in the familiarity of their conversation. The call seemed ordinary at first, with Valerie and her brother chatting about the day's events. It was during this call, shortly before 9:30 p.m., that Valerie heard an unexpected knock on her front door. She mentioned to her brother that Ben hadn't yet returned from the hospital, leaving her alone to tend to whoever might be at the door. Without alarm or hesitation, she told him she needed to go, intending to see who had come by. Her brother thought nothing of it, assuming they would talk again soon. That simple exchange would later haunt Valerie's brother, as it was the last time he would ever hear her voice. Unbeknownst to him, that knock on the door marked a pivotal and tragic moment. Valerie hung up, likely unaware of the danger waiting just outside, and her brother, unaware of the gravity of the situation, ended the call thinking his sister would be safe in her own home. Ben Daniels arrived home around 10 p.m. to an eerie and unsettling sight. The front door of the house was wide open, an unusual and alarming detail given the blistering 109-degree heat outside. Concerned, he stepped inside, only to be confronted with a nightmare that defied comprehension. In the living room, Valerie's daughters, 8-year-old Shantia and 4-year-old Duana, were huddled together, their small bodies covered in blood. Both girls had been savagely stabbed to death, their innocence stolen in an act of incomprehensible violence. In the dining room, Ben found Valerie's lifeless body. She, too, had been stabbed multiple times in what appeared to be a desperate struggle for survival. Evidence suggested that Valerie had attempted to flee, possibly heading for the back door to escape her attacker, but she was overpowered before she could make it. The sheer brutality of the scene rendered Ben speechless, and all he could do was scream in horror. His anguished cries pierced the quiet night, prompting neighbors to call the police. When officers from the Phoenix Police Department arrived, they were met with a crime scene so gruesome that it left even seasoned investigators shaken. One detective had to step outside to collect himself, overwhelmed by the sheer savagery of the murders. The image of Shantia and Duana, still in their pajamas, underscored the innocence and vulnerability of the victims. It appeared the girls were preparing for bed when the attack occurred. Detectives surmised that Valerie was likely attacked immediately after answering the knock at her door. The killer then turned their fury on her daughters before fleeing the scene. Evidence pointed to a calculated escape route. A bloody handprint on the wooden fence in the backyard indicated that the perpetrator had exited through the back door and jumped the fence. Despite the intensity of the investigation, the motive for the murders remained unclear. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of theft, and no indication of sexual assault, despite the mutilation of one of Valerie's daughters. This lack of apparent motive suggested that the killer came with only one motive of killing. The murders sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, a newly built area of Spanish-style homes known for its tranquility and family-friendly environment. Residents, who had once felt safe in their community, were left reeling from the brutality of the crime. As detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the events of that horrific night, the community was haunted by the unanswered questions surrounding the senseless loss of Valerie and her 2 young daughters. Despite their best efforts, the investigation into the murders of Valerie Pride and her daughters stalled. After 6 months with no progress, homicide detectives decided to intensify their efforts. A dedicated team returned to Valerie's neighborhood to conduct a fresh canvass of the area, re-interviewing neighbors and revisiting details of the case. They searched for any clues that may have been overlooked during the initial investigation, but their efforts yielded no significant breakthroughs. As the months turned into years, the case grew colder, leaving investigators in the community frustrated and heartbroken. 2 years after the murders, a potential lead briefly reignited hope. Investigators were called to the backyard of one of Valerie's neighbors where a knife had been discovered. The knife was similar in size to what detectives believed to be the murder weapon, sparking optimism that it might finally provide a clue to jumpstart the stalled investigation. The knife was sent for analysis, but technicians were unable to conclusively determine whether it was the weapon used to kill Valerie, Shantia, and Duana. Despite this setback, detectives remained determined, following every lead with persistence. Over the years, police pursued hundreds of potential leads and conducted thousands of interviews in their quest for answers. Their efforts extended far beyond Arizona, even taking them as far as Ohio to speak with individuals who might have information about the case. Yet, despite their tireless work, no solid suspects emerged. The investigation remained mired in uncertainty, and the answers Valerie's family and community desperately sought continued to elude them. In 2023, a new glimmer of hope emerged when Detective Dominic Rostenberg of the Phoenix Police Cold Case Unit decided to reopen the case. Leveraging advancements in forensic technology, Rostenberg and his team re-examined evidence and revisited old leads with fresh eyes. Their work demonstrated a renewed commitment to solving one of the most tragic and disturbing crimes in Phoenix's history, though it remained an uphill battle. As of 2024, the murders of Valerie Pride, Shantia, and Dwana remain unsolved. The case has haunted the community for over 40 years, leaving an enduring sense of loss and unanswered questions. What are your thoughts about these tragic stories? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, if you are new to the channel, please subscribe and turn on all notifications for upcoming crime stories. Your support is greatly appreciated. Until next time, I will see you with another episode of Urban Crime Stories.